was never born and cannot die, for it lives and is God. Within myself is the wholeness, peace, poise, and power of life. This life is health, it is abundance, it is love. There is one life, and it is the life of God, and this is my life now, and so it is. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Good morning. Good morning. I love that video. It's one of those videos that calls to me and keeps repeating itself over and over and over again, because I think it speaks of the spiritual evolution and the spiritual growth that we all go through, which is to go from putting sacredness, holiness on an object to experiencing it all around us. And I think that that's a big, giant step that we all have to take, to go from saying that the only one who can talk to God is a priest or a minister and you just have to wait in line, to saying, hey, my God's got a thing for me. And it's right here inside of me, and I can talk to it anytime I want because I am talking to me. To go from saying that this is a special day to where every day is a special day. Every day is the best day ever. And to go from looking at life as this is something that is not wonderful and incredible, to awakening every morning and seeing the majesty of it all, the glory of it all. I think that that is an important step that we all have to take, to where everything is holy now. And that takes me to my topic this morning, which is the little story and the big story. Because so often we're stuck in the little story. People do it all the time. They want to come and see me, come up to my office. Watch out. And they want to tell me all about the little story. The little story about how things aren't going right and how they done me wrong and that person left me and I got fired from here and I lost this and that. And I've got to say, wait a minute, that is not what's going on. That may appear to be what's going on, and you may have some really darn good facts to back it up, but that is not what's going on. There is something greater here that's going on in our lives, and it's really important for us to make the shift from the little story to the big story. And sometimes we think, well, you know, woe is me, I'm the only one that has to do this in life, go through the little story. And I want to tell you that that's not true, that anyone has a little story. Little stories are a dime a dozen. Doesn't make you special to have a little story. Everybody's got a little story. It's the big stories that make you special. It's the big stories that change the way you see the world. And I think that leads us into the realm where everything, even the little story, is holy now. So I want to give you some good company to stand in. One of my favorite people is Mahatma Gandhi. And this is also tied in with the children's curriculum. So those of you who have children, they're going to come home today and say, wow, we learned all about these people. And I thought that maybe we all needed to learn a little bit about these people. Is the camera on? Is it? Because there's no light. So the little story, there's a little story and a big story to everybody's life. And the little story is that Gandhi experienced a lot of discrimination. He was living in England where he was looked at as a dark-skinned man, but not as a second-class citizen. And he was a lawyer, and he was educated, and he was just living his life. And then he went to South Africa. And the way that he purchased, the way that we got around back then, which was, what, 100 years ago or 200 years ago, whenever it was, don't pin me down to time, is you would buy a ticket through the post. And so Gandhi had plenty of money, so he bought a first-class ticket for the train in South Africa. And then when he got to South Africa, he was very surprised because he was in his car with his ticket, and the conductor or one of the people of the train came in and saw him and said, "You cannot be in this first-class cabin.
you are a dark-skinned man. And I don't think they used that kind of politically correct language. You have to go, I think that they were either riding in the back of the train or literally climbing up on top of the train to hang on. You have to go back with the third-class passengers. And Gandhi was shocked and appalled, and he said, no, I have a ticket. It's a first-class ticket. And they threw him off the train. Then when he was still trying to get where he was going by stagecoach, they told him he had to get up and let a European take his place. And when he refused, he was beaten by the stagecoach driver. Now you could see that maybe he had a little story, that life was not going his way. He paid his dues. He got educated. He was an attorney. He had the money to do what he wanted to do, and yet it wasn't unfolding the way that he thought it should. Gandhi was imprisoned 4 times by the British government for something around a total of 7 years. During that time, he almost starved to death in a self-imposed hunger strike. And one of the really hard things in his life, as if all of this wasn't difficult, was watching his country go through civil war. Now, if we left it at that, that would be a little story about a guy who didn't have his experiences unfold the way that he thought, about someone who had hard times. And yet, when you look at the big story of Gandhi's life, all of those experiences led him to the place where he would lead his country to independence through this weird thing called nonviolent resistance. That's the big story of Gandhi. And it took every one of those circumstances in his life to lead him to the place where he could take the big story and live it. Don't you love Mother Teresa? Don't you think she was just born a saint? Helping the people in India and Calcutta, those who were dying in the road, she would bring them in and she would love them and she would nurture them. Her life was not always thus. The little story of Mother Teresa is that her father died when she was 8 years old. And after she was 18, she never saw her mother or her sister again for the rest of her life. The first year as a nun, she had to beg for her own food to eat, plus the supplies to teach the children that it was her job to teach. And when she was a nun, she was not as clear as you might think. She had serious doubts of faith. She wrote letters to her bishop or cardinal or whoever saying, I can't do this. I don't believe enough to be a nun. I don't believe in God enough to be a nun. I don't believe. That could be the small story of Mother Teresa. Except what happened was she went to Calcutta, India, and in 1952 she founded the first home for the dying in India. She saw people dying by the side of the road and said, your life has been miserable. You shouldn't have to die this way too. And so she brought them in and she washed them, a little human dignity. She cleaned them up. She fed them what little she had. She gave them water and she sat with them while they died. And before you know it, people from all over the world wanted to go and be with her while she sat with people while they died. One interesting thing about Mother Teresa is that when the do-gooder Americans would come, and they said, I want to do good, she would send them home. She said, we don't need you to do good. But when people would come and say, I want to love the way you love, they could stay and bring people in off the road and clean them up and give them a way to die with dignity. She opened up homes for lepers, for orphans, and homeless children. She was awarded many, many awards, including the Nobel Peace Prize, and she is one step away from sainthood through the Catholic Church. Wow. That's the big story we have to be careful not to get stuck in the little story. Everybody's got a little story. A little story doesn't make us special. It's our big story that makes us special. What's our big story? Oh, I don't know. I see your faces. You're still not convinced. How about Buddha? Siddhartha? Gautama? Here was a prince, born in a palace, lavished, spoiled, protected from everything, until one day he caught a glimpse of someone who was sick. And he began to travel outside of the palace to sneak out and to see what this world was that he had never seen. He saw someone die, and it traumatized him. I'm telling you, this was requiring issue tissues and had some trauma attached to it. He saw someone die. He didn't know people died. And he said to his servant that was with him, "What is this?" And he said, "Everyone will die. Everyone dies. Everyone will die, including you." And it freaked him out so much that he ran away from the palace. He said, there's got to be something more to life than either lavish riches or abject poverty. And so he went on his spiritual path. And at the time, the spiritual path was denying yourself of all material goods, not eating to the point where you're about to die, self-mutilation. And he did all of these things until he was about to die. He was almost dead from starvation. He went into the river for something and passed out and almost drowned. And when he came out, he said, wait a minute, maybe something's not right here. Maybe it's not all just black and white, that it's either lavish abundance or almost killing myself. And he came up with the middle path. He also ate and drank, and then he sat under the Bodhi tree. And he sat there for 49 days. And he got his big story. Because at age 35, Siddhartha achieved enlightenment, or what we would call the Christ consciousness. And Buddhism was born. Not to deny yourself and not to get so attached to materiality that you can't see anything else, but to have balance in your life. To have balance in your spiritual growth. And today, there are 400 million people who follow the path of Buddhism. That's a big impact on the world. That's a big story. And so we look at this time of year of what does this have to do with me? Is this all about something outside of myself being holy? That I'm going to celebrate the birth of Jesus in the manger in Bethlehem on December 25th. And we talked about that last week, about how that's not historically accurate. So am I going to look at something outside of myself, wanting that idea that I can have something intervene on my behalf and save me from myself? Or am I going to take a leap in growth and realize that everything is holy? And that means that if Jesus achieved the Christ consciousness, then so can we. And I think that we have a spiritual obligation to do so. To make that jump to where we don't get deterred by the world of effects. We don't get caught up in what's going on the outside. We don't buy into the small story. Well, that person's blind, and that person is crippled, and this sea is rough. We don't buy into that. But we see that there is something within us that can rise above all of that and have a different experience of life. At this time of year, are we going to look on the outside and say it's all about what kind of presents that I get and what kind of presents that I give? So it's all about how much money I can spend, or are we going to look within ourselves and say, as Meister Eckhart did, that the eternal is forever begatting the only begotten, and he's begatting him in me now. That was a Catholic priest. The eternal is forever begatting the only begotten, that birth of the sonship, generic neutral, the sonship within us all is happening over and over and over again. And I can look at that and then I can rise into that state of consciousness that says, these things and greater I can do also. Or do I want to stay in the little story? Because the little story is hard. The little story is hard. If you look at the little story of Jesus, geez Louise. He was born in relative poverty. He worked in a carpenter's shop. For 3 years, he was an itinerant preacher. He never owned a home. He never wrote a book. He never held office. Some would dispute this through the Da Vinci Code. He never had a family. He never went to college. He never put his foot inside of a big city. He never traveled more than 200 miles away from the place that he was born. He had no credentials. That's the small story. The small story is hard. It says that while he was still a young man, the tide of popular opinion turned against him. His friends all ran away. One of them denied him. He was turned over to his enemies. He went through the mockery of a trial. He was nailed upon a cross between 2 thieves. And while he was dying, his executioners gambled for the only piece of property that he had on earth, which was his coat. After he was dead, he was laid in a borrowed grave through the pity of a friend. That's the small story. That's the small story. That's the little story. You think you've got a little story? He had a little story. And yet that wasn't who he was. That wasn't the truth of him. That wasn't his big story. Because the big story is that he healed the sick, he raised the dead, he walked on water, and he calmed the seas. The big story is that today 2.1 billion people call themselves Christian. The big story is that from all the armies that have ever marched, all the navies that were ever built, all the parliaments that ever sat, and all the kings that ever reigned put together have not affected the life of man upon this earth as has the life of Jesus. That's the big story. So what kind of a story do you have? Do you have a big story? Do you have a little story? Of course you have a little story. Every one of us has a little story. Well, the internet was down. Oh my gosh. Well, they left me. Great. Now you can be who you are meant to be, with evidently who you're meant to be with. They fired me. Yay! Now you can go do what you want to do. Well, I lost all my retirement in the stock market. Wonderful. Get up and go get a job. Go do something in the world. People die 5 years after retiring anyway. This is your ticket to a long life. Welcome to Walmart. Well, I wasn't loved the way that I wanted to be loved when I was a child. Oh, please. If it didn't kill you, it made you strong. What's your big story? That's what I want to know. 30 some odd years in this profession of listening to people, often whining about their little story. I started charging people for whining. I have a sign in my office, $5 per whine. Everybody's got a little story. I want to know what our big story is. It's not about economies. It's not about relationships. It's not even about the state of our physical bodies. It's not about what happened in the past or what we're afraid will or will not happen in the future. It's about who we are. It's about who we are. And if we are true to who we are, our little stories turn into big stories. Everybody's got a little story. I want to know what our big story is. I want to know what your big story is. I want to know what our center's big story is. I want to know what our movement's big story is. I want to know what humanity's big story is. Somebody says, oh, somebody just, started a war with somebody else. That's the little story. The big story is that we are figuring out how to be at peace. Somebody says, yay, yay. John said that we have less violence and more right now. A couple of weeks ago when he was talking, right now than ever before in the history of humankind. We just have more information about the problems that are going on. We are more at peace now than we ever have been. We are healthier now than we ever have been. Even with all of the troubles, our children live longer now than they ever have. People eat more now than they ever have. And it's a good thing. The little story is the nightly news. Remember, every newscast is a prayer request. So answer that request and know the truth. There's a big story going on. We are evolving in consciousness. We are God in form as us. We are growing and expanding. And if you've got a little story, just imagine what the big story is going to be. If you've got a big little story, just imagine how big your big story is going to be. That's our job. To look even at the things that would call us to complain, would call us to feel diminished, would call us to give up, and to see that even in the midst of that, everything is holy, because everything is God, and everything is one step closer to our big story. It's our choice. I love you.